It is with some fear and some trepidation that I am diving into another YouTuber's channel today. So I was recommended by one of my subscribers, but they suggested I take a look at Amberlynn Reid. Now, this person is a fairly well-established YouTuber. I think she's been on the platform for 11 or so years at this point, and apparently there's a lot of history and there are some concerns about abusive behavior. But recently she's been talking about her diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And so this viewer was just interested in some of the thoughts that I had. Now, I come in with a lot of hesitation because just like what happened in other videos where I started talking about Ren or other content creators, these YouTubers just generally have a very loyal following. So I was worried about wading into some of the drama and not having the full picture of things. But we're gonna take it for what it is, and we're gonna dive into some aspects of her channel today. At least for a start, her two most recent videos, as of the time of this filming, where she talks about her diagnosis and her treatment and therapy for borderline personality disorder, and just to shed light on what can be a very vilified kind of diagnosis. So with all that being said, we're going to dive into her channel, into some of these videos, and we'll take it from there. Okay, so the first thing that kind of irrationally bothers me about her channel, right? And there's a bit of jealousy in here too. We're talking 245,000 subscribers, over 2.6K videos, and of course she's been posting for a lot longer than I have, but this bothers like the type A person in me. I'm trying to follow all of the rules for making like very catchy titles and eye-catching content for thumbnails, and she's just got stills basically from her videos and getting multiple thousands of views. So that's just, you know, that's just me being kind of petty and jealous. Putting all that aside, we're gonna go into this with as objective a mind as possible. Okay, so we're going to the first video that we're gonna look at, this torrid try-on haul, our mukbangs coming back, and the 9 BPD criteria traits. A lot of this is a foreign language to me, though the only part that I understood was the 9 BPD criteria traits, and that's what we're gonna be talking about. We're gonna jump straight to when she's talking about the borderline personality disorder traits. Or as close as I can get.
But here's the build update. Day 4, I'm on step 181 out of 584 steps, and this is how it looks so far. Hello. So it is the next day. It is March 2nd. So I actually saw my mom for a bit today, but I did not vlog that. I've had a pretty decent day, and if you guys hear noises in the background, it's because I'm currently drying some clothing. This is a big box because I'm actually fixing to like remodel, for the lack of a better word, out with the old and with the new, a lot of like my kitchen stuff, so I might vlog some of that, we'll see. So as you guys probably remember, I got recommended by a professional 2 borderline personality disorder books, and instead of doing both at the same time because I don't want to get overwhelmed on top of doing therapy, I decided to start with this one. And as you
Okay, understandable that she doesn't want to dive into 2 workbooks at the same time, and sometimes they do have kind of conflicting ways that they go about their process when it comes to treatment. So if you are going to do your therapy alongside workbooks, definitely make sure that it's consistent with the way that you're conceptualizing your whatever disorder or diagnosis you're dealing with, and that your therapist or whoever your professional is kind of in line with what you're working on at the time. It doesn't help so much for your therapist to be focusing on one thing and then the workbook's over here talking about something else completely different. They should inform and support each other. I am curious why she doesn't mention what exactly the title is of her mental health professional, but I guess that's neither here or there. A lot of people don't know kind of what my title is either. I've been called doctor a lot of times, but I always make sure to correct people. Like, I did not go to school for that amount of time for that, and I have not earned that degree.
You guys know I want to keep therapy sacred to myself, but I do want to share my struggles with borderline personality disorder because I struggle bad, and that is a very big part of me, and I want to be very transparent in my journey of like healing that part of me. So we're going to talk.
Okay, about the language right now, I unfortunately scrolled down and read some of the comments. A lot of people are saying that she gave herself that diagnosis. She's never been officially diagnosed. So I'm kind of curious, for those of you who are more in this community or who have followed her and watched her videos, what's the story about that? Because she's obviously seeing somebody who is treating her for borderline personality disorder, or at least that's what I gather from what she's saying. And so I'm kind of curious about people saying that she's not actually diagnosed with this. But we'll kind of go off of the assumption that she's been diagnosed and see where she's coming from with that.
Talk about chapter 1 today. So chapter 1 is called BPD 101, and some quotes from it that I want to read are: most people misunderstand what borderline personality disorder is and how it impacts people's lives, which is very true. It's not just the lives of the person that has it, but it's also like the lives of the people around that person. Also,
yeah, absolutely. In multiple relationships, that's actually one of the criteria for almost any personality disorder, is that it's not just an internal thing, but the fact that it's a personality disorder means that it leads into disordered relationships, patterns of relating to other people that are harmful either for yourself or for them.
So something else it says is getting a clear picture of your BPD is the start of a journey of self-exploration, which will allow you to grow beyond your BPD. And that change is possible. It says that many individuals who meet the criteria for BPD can look back at their childhood and adolescence and see the beginning of the symptoms and patterns, which is so beyond true.
Okay, I was just going through a DBT training. DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, is like the gold standard for treating borderline personality disorder. And so the trainer was talking about one way that borderline traits can develop. If someone felt ignored in their emotions or invalidated in their emotions early on, then they learn early on, and they are trained basically to have very large reactions, because that's the only thing that garners a response from their caregivers or from the people around them. And so that's not 100% what happens in every case, but that is a way that the trainer talked about that these kind of borderline traits can develop in some of these very intense responses to perceived little insults or slights, or even when no harm was intended, that they respond very big because they've been taught very early on that that's all people will respond to. That's the only way you'll actually get the attention that you are seeking and the care that you're seeking.
Like, I look back and realize that at the age of 16, I was struggling. So there's 9 criteria listed, and an individual needs to meet at least 5 of them to be diagnosed and qualify for the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. I'm going to read the 9 to you, and then I'm going to tell you guys which ones that I have. So number 1 is frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. 2, a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. 3, identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self.
Okay, she was taking a break there, so I'm going to pause and talk about some of what she's talking about right now. We're talking about the rapid shift between idealization and vilification of somebody. A lot of clinicians that I've worked with have talked about when they realized later on that they were working with somebody who was struggling with borderline personality disorder, that at first they seemed very personable, very eager to please. And so that comes with some of the instability of identity too, that they try to fit and mold themselves into whatever they think the other person wants. And then later on, there might be some kind of perceived insult or some way that you've wronged them, and then you've become their worst enemy. So it's a vacillation between those extremes, that push and pull, that is very characteristic of borderline personality disorder. And then when you talk about some of the other traits and symptoms that go into that, it becomes a very dangerous and harmful one in relationships and for the person.
My dryer just went off. Hold on a second. Number 4 is impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging. For example, spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating. Number 5 is reoccurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. Number 6 is affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood. So for example, intense episodic dysphoria, irritability, or anxiety usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. Number 7 is chronic feelings of emptiness. Number 8 is inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. For example, frequent displays of temper, constant anger, reoccurrent physical fights. So the last one, which is number 9, transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. And out of the 9, I have all 9, but there is one that I even questioned marking off because it's so low, like on the totem pole. So next part of this chapter was talking about how BPD is a spectrum. It says,
okay, so I gotta pause it. That really caught my attention when she said she meets all 9 criteria. I'm gonna pull this up real quick, what she was talking about. Now, I'm looking at a multi-dimensional definition and criteria for borderline personality disorder. The way that hers was structured was just a straight down checklist, basically. And this is where I might have some questions for her mental health professional. The impression that I'm getting is that she started seeing this person fairly recently. And so if that is the case, if she does not carry in a prior diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, then that diagnosis was made very quickly. And part of the features of a personality disorder is that that is one of the last resort diagnoses that you're going to make, because so many of these other symptoms are characteristic of other diagnoses that are more temporary, that can be explained more contextually. And you're talking about personality disorder is persisting across multiple environments, across long periods of time, because you're talking about there's something wrong with the way that they interact with themselves and with others. And so let me skip down to C, D, and E, right? The impairments in personality functioning and the individual's personality trait expression are relatively stable across time and consistent across situations. So this is why I'd be concerned if this new person, I'm assuming they're a new mental health professional for her, diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder right off the bat. They don't have the time and the history with them to say that this personality functioning and trait expression are stable across time and consistent across situations. They just don't know them like that. And then D, the impairments in personality functioning and the individual's personality trait expression are not better understood as normative for the individual's developmental stage or sociocultural environment. And so this is important, because if you look at all of the symptoms, borderline personality, if you're talking about impulsivity, risk-taking, antagonism, disinhibition, depressivity, like we can go down the list. A lot of these things are actually fairly normative when it comes to adolescence. And so that's an important differential piece to talk about. And that's why I'd be curious if she was coming in to me as a therapist saying, hey, I have borderline personality disorder and I've been dealing with this since I was 16. I would be digging for some actual examples of what she meant by struggling with BPD at the time, because a lot of the symptoms here are going to be seen in many 16-year-olds. Unfortunately, not that it's a good thing, but that it is normative for that stage in life. And that's why we're not going to diagnose anybody with a personality disorder until they're 18 at the very earliest. And of course, the difficulty is, again, I'm taking this with a grain of salt that some people have said she's self-diagnosed, or if she's going to a professional and has gotten this diagnosis, is that when you're talking about the impoverished, poorly developed, or unstable self-image, often associated with excessive self-criticism or chronic feelings of emptiness, that is not a very reliable source to be talking about self-diagnosing a personality disorder. And so if she were presenting this to me, if I were her therapist, I would be curious and really want to maybe get some reports from other people, other significant people in her lives, if she were willing for that to happen, of course, and to really see if this has been a persistent and stable pattern of the way that she relates to others, rather than just, oh, I've experienced this once in my life, I've experienced this a couple of times. That's where it can get a little tricky when it comes to just those checklist kinds of criteria, where it's just like, oh yeah, I did this, I've experienced that. But really looking at it as a full pattern, a long-standing and persistent pattern, instead of this has happened to me once or twice. And so it does take a lot more careful digging, a lot of follow-up questions to really come to that diagnosis, because it is a really heavy diagnosis. I think the book is not wrong. It is very misunderstood, and a lot of people will back off from you once they realize that you have BPD, and it can almost be a self-fulfilling prophecy and very isolating, in that people might not want to be around you if they know that you have that diagnosis. All right, back to the video though.
It says in here that the intensity and severity of each part of the criteria is unique to each person. So I had to answer a ton of questions to see like where you fall on the spectrum, and I fell on extreme. You're supposed to circle, is this statement for you mild, moderate, severe, or extreme? Gave a ton of statements. So like One that I circled extreme on was frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. There was quite a few that I circled extreme and severe on. Actually, I circled severe and extreme on every single one except for one. And then another.
Okay, again, issues with self-report when it comes to borderline personality disorder. If you're talking about that one of the characteristics of BPD is emotional lability, unstable emotional experiences and frequent mood changes, emotions that are easily aroused, intense and or out of proportion to events and circumstances, intense feelings of nervousness, tenseness, or panic, often reaction to interpersonal stresses. And then you're going to ask them to fill out a subjective measure of how frantic are you when you're dealing with potential rejection. You're going to get some very intense answers. Obviously, I've never read the book. I don't have that book and I haven't reviewed it. This is not a review of the book, but if you're gonna have potentially people who have BPD work through this book, I'd have some more specific language rather than just kind of copy and pasting the DSM language, because that's subject to clinical interpretation and you're asking non-clinical people to evaluate that for themselves. And that may not be helpful. She might be telling herself that her diagnosis is a lot more severe than it actually is. Of course, I don't know her, so I don't know. Again, leave that to you, the community, to kind of form your own opinions on that. Again, I'm never trying to diagnose here on this channel, so I'm just evaluating the process that she's going through, not whether or not she actually has borderline personality disorder.
Part of this chapter was just like a Q&A. So obviously I'm not going to read all of my answers to you guys because some of them are personal, but one of them I can read to you guys just so you guys can like understand me a little bit more. In what part or parts of your life, for example, relationship with family and friends, work, how you see yourself, and so on, do these symptoms cause the greatest problems? When I am in a romantic relationship with someone, it is the worst. So that's where it causes the greatest problems. But it has caused problems with family/friends as well. So it's very rare that it causes problems within my family, thankfully. But like if I have a friendship where I'm extremely close to them and I see them like a lot, it can definitely cause problems in that friendship.
That's curious that you would have this extreme borderline personality disorder that seems not to affect your family relationships, where a lot of times that's the origin. That's where you would first notice that pattern. And according to the DBT trainer, where a lot of those personality traits and habits may have their origination. So I'm curious about that family system. Again, I don't know her content well enough to know what her relationship with family members is like, but that makes me think and seems kind of atypical for someone who would say that they have a very severe case of borderline personality disorder, that, oh, things are okay with my family. It's just with friends and romantic partners, I really struggle.
And obviously when it comes to a partner, because I am talking to them a lot and they become almost like someone I'm reliant on. And I know that's also due to my BPD. When I say reliant, I mean I'm reliant on them like mentally, emotionally, due to like the fear of abandonment, which is really where BPD is like rooted from.
Okay, I know I'm pausing a lot, but what she said there does make a lot of sense, that we talk about the identity instability or the feeling of emptiness. And so yes, finding a lot of emotional support and your own sense of identity in your relationship with that other person can be very characteristic of BPD. And then that's also why when there's any perceived risk of that being taken away or you losing it, you will fight and you will hang on and you will do some scary and potentially dangerous things to try to keep that sense of identity that you've tried to build for yourself around this other person.
The last thing I want to share is a quote from here. Feeling alone is very common for people with BPD, so common that it's in the criterion, which in parentheses it says chronic feelings of emptiness, but you're not alone. Approximately 18 million or nearly 6% of adults in the United States have been diagnosed with BPD. That shocked me. And it definitely.
That also shocks me, and I looked that up. That number is slightly misleading. This is from the NIH, National Library of Medicine, and this article, they estimate the prevalence of BPD in the general population between 0.7 and 2.7%, not the 5 or 6%. They say in primary care, the prevalence is 6%, and the rate is 11 to 12% in outpatient psychiatric clinics and 22% for psychiatric inpatients, which makes sense. The more intense of a service that you are providing in the mental health world, the more likely it is that you're going to have people with personality disorders in that group. But in the general population, we're looking at a lower number of maybe 2.7% at the highest, at least based on this article, compared to the 6%.
Made me feel less alone. And this first chapter was honestly so just like validating. Like, I've already done the whole criteria thing because when I was diagnosed, I had to go through all that. But it's like just doing it again and like thinking of it differently with like a whole different mind frame. I'm able to be more like transparent with myself because I'm not ashamed anymore. For the longest time, like I was ashamed. That's why when people would be like, Amberlynn, I think you have borderline personality disorder, like I would become so defensive. Like, I don't understand why. I don't know why anyone would ever be ashamed or embarrassed of something that they went through that caused them to have this. Like, it's not your fault. Like, so if you're watching and you're struggling and you have any sort of like shame or embarrassment, simply don't. All right, you guys, we're gonna do it.
I can get behind her last message. Yes, I think part of the importance of talking about mental health, having statistics on the prevalence of things like BPD, is because there is a lot of stigma associated with it. Like I said before, it can be a very isolating disorder. Once people recognize that about you, they are very wary of becoming attached because of the stories they heard, because of the stigma associated with having a personality disorder. And so I think understanding that and recognizing that you are more than just a diagnosis of even something as big as a personality disorder is important and can be empowering to know that, hey, this is what's going on and there are treatments for it. I can do things to manage this. It is not a death sentence. And I think that's an important part of what she's doing. Again, not saying whether she has a diagnosis or not, or whether she's even a great person or a role model to follow, but more so that just being able to share that message and have that model of being willing to talk about it, not in a glorifying way, but just like, hey, I'm going through it, I'm dealing with it, I'm going through the process. I think that can be very powerful. All right, we're gonna dive into the second video where she is opening up about some of her BPD symptoms and Amazon haul. I'm going to skip the Amazon haul and try to find where she's talking about her symptoms. So this is the next video right after the first one.
Stream today. So fingers are crossed that everything goes good. I want to talk more. It's our little BPD segment of my vlogs. So on top of doing EMDR therapy for it, I also am doing workbooks that was recommended to me.
Okay, real quick pause. EMDR is not necessarily the first line that you would go to when it comes to borderline personality disorder. Like I mentioned earlier, that would generally be dialectical behavior therapy. I'm not here to critique her therapist or whoever her person is. It may be that they're just trained in EMDR and that's what they specialize in. And I can see it having practical theoretical benefits for somebody struggling with BPD. Usually it's associated with trauma, and so EMDR is really good for helping with the emotional reactivity associated with trauma, and so I can see how that can treat some of the concerns associated with borderline personality disorder. When it comes to DBT, what you're talking about is first, yes, the emotional regulation is key. That's the first step that any DBT therapist is going to work with you on, is being able to be aware and manage those emotional reactions. But then what you develop later on is interpersonal effectiveness. And this is how you change the patterns of your relationships. How can you respond appropriately to perceived provocation, or even recognize that somebody was not trying to insult you or someone's not trying to reject you or leave you, and then being able to communicate assertively instead of aggressively. So I'd say like EMDR is not a bad start. Like I don't want to hate on her therapist or whoever her person is. So it just caught me by surprise a little bit that someone would default to EMDR for something like a borderline personality disorder. But again, their process is their process. I don't have a problem with it. I'm just curious.
In my last vlog, I talked about the 9 criterias that are part of the BPD diagnosis and how you have to meet at least 5 of them. So within the 9, each one has its own like clusters and multitudes of symptoms and traits and characteristics. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to give you guys an example / symptom or thing that I deal with within each one of those things, because as you guys know, I suffer with all 9 out of the 9 listed in the criteria, which is very unfortunate and it's hard to handle. So for each one, I do have a multitude of symptoms, and I'm not going to sit here and name off every single one. Like, that is so much information, and also it's a lot of things that I'm embarrassed about. It's a lot of things that I am ashamed about. I'm not ashamed of the BPD diagnosis, but I am ashamed of some of the things that I do and have done. So number 1 is frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. So something I do with that, when I'm in a long distance relationship and I'm having an argument with my partner and they like hang up on me or they're ignoring my calls, I will literally frantically call them at least like 30 times in hopes that they will answer me. The best way I can describe it is like, it's this fire burning like urgency that I literally cannot control. Like, I get super anxious and I'm scared. I feel like they hate me. They're never going to talk to me again. So I just frantically call, text, and I genuinely look insane when I do it. So number 2 is a pattern.
Okay, I appreciate that she's going through some real world examples of some of the challenges that she has faced, especially like in this context of romantic relationships. I talked about wanting some examples earlier, so this would be helpful in informing kind of that diagnostic process. Again, I want to say that this example by itself does not qualify her to be diagnosed for borderline personality disorder. Of course, there's only one criterion, and you could be talking about a lot of different issues here. But what I would pick at is some of her language, and this would be kind of some of the DBT and CBT and me coming out and saying like, hey, you're saying that you can't control this. We're just not at a point where we've learned the skills or developed the skills to be able to manage and control that kind of situation. But yes, I can get the feeling of anxiety and panic that, oh my gosh, this person's never gonna talk to me again. I've lost them forever.
Of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. So this is something that you guys have actually noticed that I do, is I will be in a relationship with someone and I'll come on here and I'll be like, they're so perfect. I have never loved someone as much as I love this person. Like, this is the best relationship I've ever been in. That's me idolizing them. But if they do one small thing that makes me question if they love me, or makes me question their loyalty to me, or if I can trust them, or whatever it may be, instantly those feelings go away. And I think, oh my God, like, they hate me, so I really truly hate them in this moment. Everything is bad, and like all of the good just like completely vanishes. So that is what people call the black and white thinking. Number 3.
Yeah, black and white thinking, and cognitive behavioral therapy labeled as a cognitive distortion, and that's definitely something that her therapist should be drawing her attention to, this pattern. And recognizing that it's a pattern is important, so that when we start having those kinds of thoughts, it's important that we don't let our feelings dictate how we are responding, but really evaluating the situation, using our emotional regulation and distress tolerance skills to bring that emotional intensity and level down so that we can think clearly. Am I engaging in this pattern of black and white thinking that has gotten me in trouble in the past?
3 is identity disturbance, which is markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. So something that you guys have actually noticed is I adopt people's personalities or behaviors or the way they speak, and it's something like I genuinely cannot control. Number 4.
Yeah, so in combination with what she was talking about, the extremes of the relationship, what I've heard from clinicians, clients with BPD will come off very likable at first because they are talking like you, they seem to share the same interests as you, and they're very warm and effusive because that's part of the idealizing part. Like, you're the best therapist I ever had, man. All my other ones are terrible, and they just were not the right person for me, but you are it. Like, I see we have so much in common, all of this stuff. And then slowly, as they get more comfortable with you, you start seeing that there is less substance to that either therapeutic relationship or in a interpersonal relationship, that actual relationship, than you thought initially. I wouldn't say this is intentional manipulation, but it's part of the pattern of borderline personality disorder, and that people start getting a sense that, hey, something is off with this relationship.
Impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, for example, spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating, etc. So I actually never realized that the way that I eat and my eating issues could be due to having BPD, but it turns out it very well could be. Number 5 is reoccurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. So sometimes when I'm having like an actual full-fledged meltdown, I threaten suicide. I have suicidal ideation. I do want to make it very clear, I will never do something to harm myself. But in that moment, during that meltdown, more than anything else in the world, because of the pain that I feel, because when you do have BPD, like the pain that you feel is literally overbearing. But because of that pain, I genuinely do not want to be alive anymore in that moment. I have actually embarrassingly documented a moment of me having that before. It was during like 100 days of uploading. I think it was in like 2019 or 2020, a video of me expressing that I felt suicidal. I didn't say those words completely, but it was how I was feeling in the moment. You guys couldn't see that in the video, but I was hurting. I was hurting really bad. And a lot of people was calling me a liar. And in return, it was actually just making me feel worse. Like, this is hard for me to open up about, like extremely hard. And it's things that like I've always suffered with in private. I remember one of the first times that I actually expressed out loud my suicidal ideation. I was 15 years old and I actually was sent to a mental hospital. But again, I would never in a million years do anything to hurt myself. It's just in those moments, like during a meltdown, you hurt so bad that just seems like the best option. So it's a
Yeah, I mean, she's not wrong. Suicidal ideation is unfortunately a common symptom across many psychiatric diagnoses. And the scary part is that you can say all you want that, I'd never do it in a million years. But then in those moments, like she's saying, if you're talking about somebody who has BPD, that overwhelming feeling of pain, isolation, rejection, coupled with the impulsivity, it's really hard to say what someone might or might not do because they don't feel like they're in their right minds at that moment. And so that's why it's important to have coping and safety planning in place, emergency numbers to call, people who you can rely on for support, because especially from a liability point of view for my clients, I'm not going home with them. I don't want to go home with them. I don't monitor them 24/7. And so it's important for me to be talking to, if they're a teenager or a child, their guardians or their parents, or if they're an adult, loved ones around them, family members who can support them and be checking in on them, as well as them having access to emergency numbers if needed. But this is also why I feel like it'd be very challenging to open up about your mental health online for strangers to watch, because like I'm reiterating so many times, I don't see the full picture on here. I see what she chooses to present, and it looks like she edits a lot less than other YouTubers, but at the same time, I'm still not going to be able to pick up on all the nuances of everything that she's experiencing, because that's just not how the medium works. And so she was talking about being judged over that one video where she was expressing feeling very depressed, very isolated, and wanting to end it all. And people were judging her, evaluating her, oh, you're not telling the truth, you're just playing this up, or whatever they might have been saying. And I could see how that could make things feel a lot worse.
Fleeting thought, and I don't want anyone to worry about me, please. Like, this is just another one of those symptoms that I suffer with. So number 6 is affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood. So for example, intense episodic dysphoria, irritability, or anxiety usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. So this is very much like my mood swings, where something so small could happen, but I feel so strongly about it. So a good example of that would be if I send a long, sweet message to my partner saying like, I love you, I've been thinking about you, I miss you, like I can't wait to talk to you again, just whatever it may be. And like all they send back in response is love you too. That triggers something inside of me so hardcore where I feel uncared for, I feel unloved, I feel unappreciated, and it absolutely like sends me into this like abandonment feeling and I spiral. It leaves.
Okay, I know you all saw me laughing at that. The only reason I was laughing was because like almost anyone would be bothered by that. You put a lot of thought into this message that you're sending and you get like a K or a thumbs up. So that's what I was laughing at, that's almost a universal thing, but of course this is not a universal symptom. It's brought out as a lot of things in BPD to an extreme degree, where for her maybe that might mean rejection, whereas for people who don't have BPD it might be annoying but not devastating.
Makes me anxious and worried, and sometimes it sends me into a meltdown, and sometimes like I'm genuinely just like frantically journaling about it. Number 7 is chronic feelings of emptiness. So that's pretty explanatory. Sometimes like I feel so lonely that I genuinely feel like I'm the last person on earth. So as I'm editing this, I'm realizing that I was way too vague with that answer. But for me, when I have chronic loneliness, which is quite frequently, it is heavy, it is painful, it sends me down major depressive episodes. Like, I can be in a room with 10 people and feel lonely. I can be in my room by myself and feel lonely. I could be hugging someone I love and feel lonely. It doesn't matter. Sometimes the loneliness like genuinely makes me feel like I am not loved by a single person on this planet, and I am not cared for by a single person on this planet.
And as she's talking about this is something that I struggle with a lot of my clients, especially when we're doing stuff with like DBT and CBT. It's like, well, it doesn't feel that way, right? Like if she's saying she's hugging her significant other, her romantic partner, right? And that is a very clear sign that there's affection, there's a togetherness there. And she's saying, I don't feel that. I still feel alone. And this is why we can't run our lives based on how we feel, because those feelings are not always grounded in reality. And that's a lot of what DBT and CBT kind of get at. But a lot of times we need to take those steps to emotionally regulate, bring down our emotional level, so that we can think more rationally through what is actually true, what's actually going on here. And I am curious, as she's talking about these very personal things, obviously I haven't dug through all of the comments on her videos and things like that, but I am curious what her community's response to these sharings are. That it does seem very open and vulnerable, whether misguided or not. She is sharing something that is affecting her deeply. And so I'm curious what the level of support and interaction has been like for those of you who are familiar with her channel.
And it sends me down like a pretty bad depressive episode for sure. Number 8 is inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. So for example, frequent displays of temper, constant anger, or reoccurrent physical fights. So for me, I'm not like a physically abusive person, but I have done some yelling. I'm not gonna lie about that. If I feel uncared for or like not seen or unheard, which is actually a BPD symptom, sometimes it genuinely can lead to like loud yelling with like hysterical crying. So the last one, which is number 9, which is transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. So sometimes I feel completely detached, like from myself and from my memories. So that's why sometimes I can share something from like my childhood that genuinely hurt me, and I could seem like unbothered, or I could like nervously laugh about it, while other times I can share the exact same story and cry about it. So those are just some examples of like the multitude, and I'm telling you, a multitude of things that I deal with that I didn't share. So those are just like a few that I wanted to just like give you guys a little look into, because I'm telling you, this is a lot of information for me to absorb and for me to share. I'm a bit overwhelmed, and I don't want to overwhelm anyone else. And I feel better sharing this part of me, because all of these issues that I've had for so long, I've been like, what is wrong with me? What is happening? Finally, there was a name to it, and I was ashamed. And that's why I didn't tell you guys when I was first diagnosed, because I was like, what, are you joking me? And slowly I've realized there's nothing to be ashamed about. Like, yeah, I'm ashamed of some things I've done in the past, of course, and some things that I currently do. But like, I cannot show you guys that I'm improving unless I show you guys certain things that I have done and certain things that I do, you know, a year or two down the line, be like, you guys, remember when I told you I did A, B, and C? I haven't done A, B, and C in 6 months. So I know as I do more of this workbook, there's going to be a lot more topics of like more symptoms and more things like that. So I will share more of that when we get to those chapters.
Yeah, so again, ending on an empowering and uplifting message, I think, like she said, there's power in being able to share, even with an unseen audience, what you're struggling with, what you are working on, because a lot of the stigma and the challenge associated with these mental health disorders is that we want to keep it hidden away. We think other people will think this of us. People will hate me. People will disown me, will reject me. And then it can be very freeing to break from that belief and say, this is just what I'm dealing with right now. And no matter people's responses to it, there's at least power in being able to name what's going on. And she said that having that diagnosis finally organized, put all of these random seeming things into one complete category of BPD so that she understood this is the pattern that my life has been taking, and now I can do something about it. So I've got no arguments with that piece. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'll just end going back to this piece here. For anyone who's following along, and if you're concerned that you might have BPD based on some of the symptoms that she's talking about, and you're like, hey, that kind of happens to me too, remember that it is kind of a diagnosis of last resort when there's no better explanation. And a lot of these symptoms are characteristics in other diagnoses as well. So just because you check off a couple boxes does not mean you automatically have borderline personality disorder. Again, I'll point to this C criterion where the impairments are relatively stable across time and consistent across situations. That's what we're looking for as like one of the hallmarks and defining characteristics of a personality disorder, is that this happens no matter where you're at and across a broad period of time. So this is a difficult watch. I don't have much of a final conclusion for you all. Again, I gave my thoughts as she was talking, and it helps to have her thoughts to kind of organize what I would like to say about personality disorders in general, borderline personality disorder specifically, and some of the treatments associated with it. Again, I don't have the history to say whether she's being genuine or if she's a very good actress or whatever. I think the conversations about mental health are important. Again, I have some concerns about potentially self-diagnosing or coming into a therapist's office and saying, I have BPD, and treat me as such. I think that would be on the professional to do their own due diligence and come up with a diagnosis of their own, and whether that confirms or rejects that hypothesis that the client brings in, that's a separate discussion that you all have to have together. But let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts on what she has said? If you'd be interested in more, I guess, kind of deep dives like this, following along with her vlog as she talks about her treatment and therapy process. For now, please do like and subscribe. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this video, and I'll see you all next time.